Hello, Garrett here with Boats.net. Today we're working on a 1999 Yamaha B90TLRX, and today we're looking at the carbs on this particular outboard. Can be kind of tricky, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the carbs, take them to the bench, break them down, see what kind of condition they're in. So if you need to clean your carbs, let's grab a couple tools and get started. Alright guys, this job can be a little bit tricky at times, so I'm going to rate it at about skill level 2. It's going to require a little bit of patience. Now as far as the tools go, on your screwdriver side you're going to need a variety of sizes. I have a Phillips flat and a smaller flathead here, an impact driver possibly, a 3/8 extension, a 3/8 ratchet, a swivel 10mm socket, importantly a 10mm thin wall socket. You'll need that for getting out the float seal in the carburetor. A soft blow hammer, a pair of needle nose pliers, a couple different pick tools, possibly a pen light, and a nylon bristle brush. Now as far as the parts go, check out our exploded diagrams at Boats.net. They give you a really good breakdown of how the carburetor is disassembled and put back together. Speaking of carburetors, this engine has 3, so take note you're going to need 3 separate repair kits. They're sold individually. So get your parts and tools together and let's turn some wrenches. Alright, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the cowling so we can actually access the carburetors. There's 2 latches on this particular outboard. There's one on the front and there's one on the back. Once you've latched them, it simply just lifts off like that. Let's actually take off the silencer cover. Just all you need for this one is a Phillips head screwdriver. It's 4 bolts. Alright, just lift it up just like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these 2 bolts here. That way I can unscrew them and pull the whole bank of carbs off at one time. It just takes just a 10mm socket. As you take note on this lower bolt here that there's an actual ground wire attached to it. So just keep that in mind when you're going to put it back together, because it can get tucked up underneath the tank and you might overlook it, and then you're going to have starting issues next time you try to run it. All right, now we're going to start unbolting the carburetors. Now, before we actually completely remove them, we're going to undo the linkage on the side. So I'm going to walk around here and I'll show you how to get it done. If you look here at these 3 points, there's just little pop pins. So all it just takes is a little bit of pressure and they'll actually pop right off just like that. Okay, now before I can actually pull the carbs off the engine and take them to the bench, there's a few connections I have to remove. One of them is a vacuum line right on this side of the engine. We have 2 hoses to disconnect on the back side of the engine, as well as an electrical connection on the side of the carburetors themselves. So let me get those removed and we can take it to the bench. We have our fuel hose. Sometimes these fuel lines can get a little seized on the nipple. So what I generally do is I'll take a pair of needle nose pliers and I'll just gently twist left to right on the hose, and that'll break it free and make it come off a lot easier. Now let's move on to our little vacuum line. Pull it back, and just like I said before, take your pair of needle nose and just gently work it back and forth to break it free. And if you look down inside here, there's an actual vacuum line we have to take off as well. The manual states to actually remove this electrothermal valve from the wire, the leads underneath this boot. But personally, I'm not going to go into this portion of the carburetor, so I don't want to introduce any debris or possibly damage an O-ring or a gasket or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is actually disconnect the wires from the harness itself. We have one that's actually tied into the harness on this portion, and then there's a ground bolt bolted onto the side of the block. Disconnect this wire here. It's the blue wire. Now as for our ground bolt, it's a little tricky to get to, so I'm going to use a little bit longer extension and a 10mm swivel socket. All right. Now that we've got the carb bank off, let's take it over to the bench and tear them down. Okay guys, now that we've got the carbs pulled off the motor, I've got them over here at the bench. I actually want to show you something that's pretty important as far as putting these back together, because each carb is not identical. They do go in their own separate location. So if you take a look at here, this is the orientation that they'll be sitting on the motor. And if you notice, starting from the bottom carb, we've got an arm here that actually hooks up to the oil delivery system. And then here's our fuel enrichment section. And if you notice at the top carburetor, it looks a lot similar to the bottom carb, but with exception of the actual rod for the oil delivery system. So you've got oil delivery system rod, fuel enrichment pump, and then carburetor that does not have the rod. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to separate the fuel lines from each carburetor. That way I can work with them individually and not have them all tied together. And as you're doing this, it's really important to take caution when removing the fuel lines, because as they sit on the motor, they do tend to dry rot and they get brittle. And if you're not careful, you may end up breaking one and having to replace them, or order parts that you didn't necessarily need to start with. So it's a good idea to take very good care when removing these fuel lines. Now actually here on this center carburetor, you can actually see there where that fuel line is dry rotted and cracked. Chances are I'm not going to be able to remove this without breaking it, so I'm going to have to replace it. And like I said before, on the fuel line and vacuum lines on the motor, it's a good idea to take your pair of needle nose pliers and just gently twist left and right to free up the hose. You can see here where it's been dry rotted and actually cracked. Definitely going to have to replace this little piece of hose. We've got our carbs separated. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to get me a drain pan, some carburetor cleaner, and I want to spray these carbs down to remove any type of debris that may be on the outside of them, because what's on the outside, I definitely don't want it getting on the inside once I open them up. All right, now it's time to remove the float bowl itself. Now sometimes these can be a little bit of a pain to get the actual Phillips head screws out of them, because especially in marine engines, they tend to corrode, and when that happens, it could seize the threads in place. There's a nifty little trick I can show you, what's called shocking the threads. And all you do is simply put your screwdriver in place, take a soft blow hammer, and just a light tap on top of the screwdriver. And just do that for all 4 screws. Let's see if it worked. Just like that. All right, now we're going to carefully remove our float bowl and see what it looks like inside. It doesn't look all that bad. It looks pretty clean actually. Gonna take my nifty pick tool here and remove this gasket and inspect it. Obviously somebody's been into this carburetor before, because it's actually pinched between the float bowl and the actual carburetor housing itself. Next step here is we're going to remove the actual float itself. Should simply lift right out, just like so. Remove the float needle. What I'm do is take a little pick tool, try to ride it over this ridge at the end here, just like that. Okay, we're going to check our float needle, and the way we do that is by actually looking at the rubber tip here and see if we notice any pitting, and I do indeed see a little bit of pitting on it. So that tells me that this float needle wasn't necessarily seating properly. So we're going to replace it as well. Now we've looked at the float needle, we've determined that we're going to replace it. Next thing we're going to do is actually check out the float itself. Just going to, inspect the float for any cracks, any breaks, or anything like that. Just going to flip it over on both sides and have a look. I'm not seeing anything damaged on it, so it looks like we're going to be good there. Let's go ahead and pull out our float seat. And this one's a little bit tricky. You're going to need what's called a shallow-walled 10mm socket. And the issue is with the carburetor, you need a thin-walled socket to get past the two little ears on the carburetor housing itself. There's also an O-ring on the bottom side of this as well. Take note of that because you'll have to replace that. Okay, now that we've got our float seat removed from the carburetor, next thing I'm going to do is tackle the actual jets themselves. And there's an important thing to take note with these older carburetors. There's a really good chance that your jets may be seized in place. So it's a good idea to have some type of penetrating oil like PB Blaster, or what I'm using here. It's a Yamaha product. It's called Yamalube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on my safety glasses because I don't want this stuff to get in my eyes, and I'm just going to spray each port and let it sit for a few minutes and let that oil do its job. That way I don't risk damaging anything removing it. Okay, now we've let the oil sit in there for a little while. Let's go ahead and remove both the pilot and the main jets. When you do so, you want to make sure that your screwdriver is planted in there firmly because this stuff is brass. And you do risk damaging it if you're not removing it properly. There's our pilot jet. We've got it removed. Set it off to the side. Now let's remove the main jet. All right. Okay, we've got both our jets out. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to visually inspect and see if any of the holes in the jets themselves are clogged in any way. We'll take some carburetor cleaner and we'll put it to the end of the jet and we'll spray and we'll see if it shoots out the other end. So this pilot jet, it's in good shape. We don't need to replace it or anything like that. Next, we're going to do the same thing with our main jet. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to put some carburetor cleaner in the pilot and the main jet holes to clean out any gunk that may be inside of there, as well as our float needle set. Just going to spray that out real good. Now we've let that sit. We're going to blow the holes out with some compressed air. Going to make sure we get down inside every one of these holes. Make sure it's blown out properly. Now that we've got our jets cleaned, everything tidied up inside the carburetor, let's take a look at our pilot screw and see what kind of condition the tip of it's in. And just by looking at it, it's in awesome shape actually. I don't see any wear or pitting or anything like that on it. So we're good to go. We can use this pilot screw as well. So I'm going to put it back in and then we can put it back together. Whenever you're installing the pilot screw, to screw it all the way in until it bottoms out. Okay, we're bottomed out. So once we have it bottomed out, we want to back off 1 1/4 turns. So there's 1/2, there's a full turn, and then we're going to do a 1/4, just like that. We'll take our pilot jet, set it down inside there. And we're just going to snug this up. We don't want to over tighten it because the jet is brass, and with using a steel screwdriver you do risk damaging it. We've got the pilot jet seated, so now what we're going to do is out of our kit we're going to take a brand new rubber cap and put it right on top of it, just like that. Now let's move on to the main jet. You look here, there's two collars on this particular jet. And if you look, one end has a giant hole on the other side of the collar, and the other end does not. You want to insert the side without the hole in first. And then take our cap and just thread it back in to seat that main jet in place. We've got our float seat here, and at the end of the float seat, not the side that the socket is attached to, but the other end piece, we need to install an O-ring in this particular portion. And if you look at our O-rings here that came in our kit, we've got two different size O-rings. For the float seat, we're going to use the smaller diameter O-ring for the float seat. Going to slide the O-ring on just like so. Just wait until it bottoms out and just give it a slight little tug. We've got our little clip here. It's got a portion that's sticking straight up at a 90-degree angle, and it's got a little box end on it. We want to insert this box portion onto our float itself. Slide it over just like that. We're going to make sure we take our little rubber cap that came in our carburetor repair kit, and we're going to place it on top of our new float needle. I'm going to take my index finger on the float, and I'm going to push down. I'm going to apply pressure on the clip to get it to stick. And I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to click it in just like that into the groove. That way the needle is set onto the float. I'm going to take our new pin that came in the kit, slide it into place. I'm going to just sit it inside the carburetor, making sure our float needle lines up with our seat. Now we're going to take our O-ring that came in our gasket kit for the float bowl and lightly set the gasket, make sure the O-ring is inside the valleys of the float bowl. So we're going to set it in just like so. Once it's set, then I can grab the float bowl and simply flip the carburetor over, and then we can put our screws in place. All right, we've gotten them all tightened up good. This carburetor's taken care of. Now the next thing I need to do is do the exact same thing that I did this with carburetor with the remaining two. So let me go ahead and get them taken care of, and we can put it back on the unit. All right, we've got carburetors 2 and 3 all ready to go. Next thing we have to do is tackle that piece of broke fuel line that I mentioned earlier. So let's go ahead and get that knocked out. We've got our piece of broken hose off. We got a little small section, a 1/4 inch fuel line here. What I'm going to do is we're just going to match it up as close as possible. Take my pair of side cutters. I'll just snip it to the appropriate length, just like that. Just like that. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to take our bracket. We're going to lay it down flat on our table with our bolts sticking out. And we're going to take our carbs and we're just going to slide the bolts back through on each of the 3 carburetors. We've got our bank of carbs ready. Let's go back over to the engine and put them in place. All right, we're going to actually thread the top carburetor in first, because that way it'll help support the weight of the remaining 2 carburetors and make it a lot easier to hook everything else back up. I'm going to route my vacuum line back through to the other side, as well as our wiring. Okay, let's get all our hoses and electrical connections put back in place. All right, we're going to take our little vacuum line that we removed off initially, I'm going to push it back on. Let's go ahead and hook up our blue lead to our thermal valve. Just like that. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to rehook up our throttle linkage to the 3 carburetors. 1, 2, and 3. Now our throttle linkage is working properly. Make sure you don't forget to reinstall your oil injection linkage, because if you don't, the engine no longer is getting supplied with oil, and if that happens, you're going to have some engine failure. All right, this job's all wrapped up. Listen, for all the parts used in this project and more, come find us at boats.net and we'll get you taken care of. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the section below and I'll do my best to answer them. Just want to say thanks for watching and we'll see you next time.